full advantage of all its features. Selenium provides support for different programming languages like Java, Python, C#, Ruby. So you can write your test scripts in any language you like. One need not know in-depth or advanced knowledge of these languages. Also, Selenium supports different operating systems. It has supports for Windows, Macs, Linux, even Ubuntu as well. So you can run your Selenium test on any platform of your choice. And hence, Selenium is the most popular and widely used automation tools for automating your web applications. Selenium set of tools. So let's go a little more deeper into Selenium. As I said, Selenium is not a single tool. It is a suite of tools. So let's look at some of the major components or the tools in Selenium and what they have to offer. So Selenium has 4 major components. 1. Selenium IDE. It's the most simplest tool in the suite of Selenium. It is integrated development environment. Earlier, Selenium IDE was available only as a Firefox plugin, and it offered a simple record and playback functionality. It is a very simple to use tool, but it's mainly used for prototyping and not used for creating automation in the real-time projects because it has its own limitations like any other record and replay tool. Selenium RC. This is nothing but Selenium Remote Control. It is used to write web application tests in different programming language. What it does, it basically interacts with the browser with the help of something called as RC server. And how it interacts is it uses a simple HTTP post GET request for communication. This was also called as Selenium 1.0 version, but it got deprecated in Selenium 2.0 version and was completely removed in 3.0, and it was replaced by WebDriver. And we will see in detail as why this happened. Selenium WebDriver. This is the most important component in the Selenium suite. It is a programming interface to create and execute test cases. It is obviously the successor of the Selenium RC which we talked about because of certain drawbacks which RC had. So what WebDriver does is it interacts with the browsers directly, unlike RC where the RC required a server to interact with the browser. And the last component is the Selenium Grid. So Selenium Grid is used to run multiple test scripts on multiple machines at the same time. So it helps you in achieving parallel execution. Since the Selenium WebDriver you can only do sequential execution, Grid is what comes into picture where you can do your parallel execution. And why is parallel execution important? Because in real-time environment, you always have the need to run test cases in a distributed environment. And that is what Grid helps you to achieve. So all this together helps us to create robust web application test automation. And we will go in detail about each of these components. So before that, let's look at the history of Selenium version. So what did Selenium version comprised of? It had an IDE, RC and Grid. And as I said earlier, there were some disadvantages of using RC. So RC was on its path of deprecation and WebDriver was taking its birth. So if you look at Selenium 2 version, it had an earlier version of WebDriver and also the RC. So they coexisted. From 3.0 onwards, RC was completely removed and WebDriver took its place. There is also a 4.0 version around the corner and it has more features and enhancements. Some of the features which are talked about are W3C WebDriver standardization, improved IDE and improved Grid. Now let's look at each of the components in the Selenium suite. Selenium IDE is the most simplest tool in the suite of Selenium. It is nothing but an integrated development environment for creating your automation scripts. It has a record and playback functionality and is a very simple and easy to use tool. It is available as a Firefox plugin and a Chrome extension. So you can use either of this browser to record your test scripts. It's a very simple user interface using which you can create your scripts that interact with your browser. The commands created in the scripts are called Selenese commands and they can be exported to the supported programming language and hence this code can be reused. However, this is mainly used for prototyping and not used for creating automation for your real-time projects. Why? Because of its own limitation which any other record and replay tool has. So a bit history of Selenium IDE. So earlier Selenium IDE was only a Firefox extension. So we saw that IDE was available since the Selenium version 1. Selenium IDE died with the Firefox version 55. That was, IDE was stopped supporting from 55 version onwards. And this was around 2017 timeframe. However, very recently, all new brand Selenium IDE has been launched by Apply Tools. And also they have made it a cross-browser. So you can install the extension on Chrome as well as an add-on on Firefox browser. So they completely revamped this IDE code and now they have made it available on the GitHub under the Apache 2.0 license. And for the demos today, we'll be looking at the new IDE. Now with this new IDE also comes a good amount of features. Reusability of test cases, better debugger, and most importantly, it supports parallel test case execution. So they have introduced a utility called Selenium Side Runner that allows you to run your test cases on any browser. So you can create your automation using IDE, say on Chrome or Firefox, but through command prompt, using your side runner, you can execute these test cases on any browser, thus by achieving your cross-browser testing. Control flow statement. So initially in the previous versions of IDE, there were control flow statements available. However, one had to install a plugin to use them. But now it is made available out of box. And what are these control flow statements? These are nothing but your if-else conditions, the while loops, the switch case, and so on. It also has an improved locator functionality. That means it provides a failover mechanism for locating elements on your web page. So let's look at how this IDE looks and how do we install it and start working on that. So for that, let me take you to my browser. So say, let's go to the Firefox browser. So on this browser, I already have the IDE installed. So when you already have an IDE installed, you will see an icon here which says Selenium IDE. And how do you install this? You simply need to go to your Firefox add-ons. Here, where it says find more extension, so just type in Selenium IDE and search for this extension. So in the search results, you see this Selenium IDE, just click on that. And now since I've already installed, here it says remove. Otherwise, for you, it is going to give you an add button here. Just click on the add button. It will install this extension. Once it is installed, you should be able to see this Selenium IDE icon here. Okay, so now let's go ahead and launch this IDE. So when I click on that, it is going to show me a welcome page where it's going to give me a few options. The first option is it says record a new test case in a new project. So straight away, if you choose this option, you can start recording a test case. In which case, it's going to just create a default project for you, which you can save it later. Then open an existing project. So you can open if you already have a saved project. Create a new project and close. So I already have an existing project with me for the demo purpose. So I'll go ahead and open that. So I'll say open existing project and I have created a simple script. What the script does is it logs me into the Facebook using a dummy username and password. That's all. It's a very simple script with few lines and this is what it's going to do. So what we will simply do is we'll just run the script and see how it works. For that, I'm just going to reduce the test execution speed so that you should be able to see every step of execution here. Alright, so what I'll do now here is I'll just adjust this window and I'll just simply say run current test. Alright, so I'll just get this side by side so that you should be able to see what exactly the script is doing. Okay, so now you're able to see both the windows. Okay, so now it's going to type in your user email here. There you go. And now it will enter the password and it has clicked on the login button. So it's going to take a while to say login. And since these are the dummy IDs, you are not able to log in here and you're going to see this error window. Fine. That is what is the expected output here. Now on the ID, if you look here, after I execute the test case, every statement or every command which I have used here is colored coded in green. So that means this particular step was executed successfully. And then here in the log window, it will give you a complete log of this test case, right from the first step till the end. And your end result is, it says FB login, which is my test case name, completed successfully. Let's look at few components of this IDE. The first one is the menu bar. So let's go to our IDE. Alright, so the menu bar is right here on the top. So here is your project name. So either you can add a new project here or rename your project. So since we already have this project, which is named as Facebook. And then on the right, you have options to create a new project, open an existing project, or save the current project. And then comes our toolbar. So using the options in this toolbar, you can control the execution of your test cases. So first one here is the recording button. So this is what you use when you start recording your script. And then on the left, you have two options here to run your test cases. The first one is run all tests. So in case you have multiple test cases written here, you can execute them one by one sequentially by using this run all test. Else what you can do is if you just want to run your current test, this is what you would use. Then IDE has this debugger option which you can use to do a step execution. So say for example, now whenever I run the scripts, it's going to execute each and every command here sequentially. So instead, if I just select the first command and say do step execution, all right, so what it does is the moment it finishes the first command, which is opening of Facebook, right, I think which is already done here. Yeah. All right. So once this is done, it is going to wait immediately on the second command and it says pause debugger. So from here, you can do whatever you would like to do. In case you want to change the command here, you can do that. You can pause your execution, you can resume your execution here, right? You can even completely stop your test execution, or you can just select this to run the rest of the test case. So if we say run the test case, what it is going to do is it's just going to simply go ahead and complete the test case. Now, there is another option here, which is, you see the timer there, which says test execution speed. So to execute your test cases in the speed you want. Say whenever you're developing an automation script, right, and say you want to give a demo. So you need to control the speed sometimes so that the viewer is able to exactly see all the steps which is being performed. And this gives you an option to control that complete execution, right? So do you see the grading here? So we have somewhere from fast to completely slow execution. So the previous demo which I showed was I controlled the speed and then I executed it so that we could see every command how it is being executed. All right. So what's the next? This is called as an address bar. So whenever you enter an URL here, that is where you want to conduct your test. And another thing what it does is it keeps a history of all the URLs which you have used for running your test. Then here is where your script is recorded. So each and every instruction is displayed here in the order in which you have recorded the script. And then if you look here, you have something called as log and reference. So now log is an area where it records each and every step of your command as and when they get executed. Right? So if you see here, it says open https facebook.com and OK. So that means this command was executed successfully. And after the complete test case is done, it gives you whether the test case passed or failed. So in case there is a failure, you'll immediately see this test case is failed in red color. Also, there is something called as reference here. For example, say if I click on any of this command, the reference tab, what it is going to show me is details of this command which I have used in the script. It gives you the details of the command as well as what the arguments have been used or how is that you need to be using this particular command. Okay, so now what we'll do is let's go ahead and write a simple script using this IDE. So with this you'll get an idea as how do we actually record scripts in IDE. So for that I have a use case here, a very simple use case. So what we will do is we will open amazon.in, then we'll simply search for say product iPhone. And once we get that search page where all your iPhones are displayed, we will just do an assert on the title of the page. Simple. All right. So let's do that. So first thing what I need is an URL. Okay. So first let me go to my Firefox browser here and say amazon.in. So why I'm doing this? Just to simply get the right URL, absolute URL path here. And so that I don't make any mistakes while typing in the URL. Okay. So I got this. So let me close all these windows. I don't need any of this. Let's minimize this. Alright, so here what I will do, in the tests tab, I'll say add a new test and name this test as Amazon search. Done. I'll say add. Now I'll enter this URL which I just copied it from my browser. Okay, and then I'll just say start recording. So what it did was, since I've entered the URL in this address box, it just opened the amazon.in URL. Now let's do our test case. So in my test case, what I said was I want to search for iPhone. Once I have this, I'm just going to click on my search button. So now this gives me a list of all iPhones. And then I said I want to add an assertion on the title of this page. So for me to do that, what IDE gives me an option is I have to just right click anywhere on this page and you'll see the Selenium IDE options here. So in this, I will select assert title and then I will close this browser. So that kind of completes my test case. So now take a look at all the steps which is created for me. So it says open / because I've already provided the URL here. So either you can replace it with your regular URL or you can just leave it as it is. So what I will do, since this is going to be a proper script and I might be using this to run it from my command prompt also. So I'll just replace this target with the actual URL. And then what it is doing, it is setting a window size. Then there are whatever I did on that particular URL on that website, it has recorded all the steps for me. So this is where it says type into this particular text box, which is my search box. And what did it type? iPhone. This was the value which I entered. Now there was one more feature which I told you in this new ID, which I said it has a failover mechanism for your locating techniques. Now that is what this is. Now if you look here, this ID is equal to 2-tab search text box. This is nothing but that search box where we entered the text iPhone. And it has certain identification through which this IDE identifies that web element. And that has multiple options to select that particular search box. So right now what it has used is ID is equal to 2-tab search box. However, if you know the different locating techniques, you will be able to see here that it has other techniques also which it has identified, like the name and the CSS and the XPath. So how does this help in failover is, say tomorrow if Amazon.in website changes the ID of this element, right? You are not going to come and rewrite the scripts again. Instead, by using the same script, what it will do is, if this particular ID fails, if it is unable to find the element using the first locator, which is the ID, it simply moves to the next available ones and it tries to search for that element until one of these becomes true. That is what was the failure mechanism which has got added now. It's a very brilliant feature because most of our test cases break because of element location techniques. Well, let's come back to this. So then we added an assert title, right? So what is assert title here? It simply captures the title of that particular page and it checks. This is all. A very simple test case. So what we will do now is, we will stop the recording and then I've also given a closed browser. So right now what I'll do is, I'll just comment this out. Why? Because if I just run this test case, it's going to be very fast and you might not be able to catch the exact command execution what has happened. Alright, so right now I'll just disable it so that it will just do all these test cases and it just stays there without closing the browser. So now I'll just say run the current test case. So your Amazon in is launched. Okay, it is typed in the iPhone. It's also clicked on the search. So it is done. So now if you look here, since we are in the reference tab, it is not able to show. So let's go to the log. And now let's see the log. So it's going to be a running log. So if you notice here, the previous examples which we have run for Facebook is also in the same log. So we will have to see the log from running Amazon search because that's our test case. So if you see here, every command line, right, was executed successfully. Assert title was also done and your test case was executed successfully. So it passed. Now what we will do is, on this assert title, I'll just modify this and let's say just add some text. I'll just add double S here. Now this, by intentionally, I'm going to fail this test case just to show you that whenever there is a test case failure, how does the ID behaves and how do you get to know the failures. Alright, so I'll just run the test case again. So before that, let's close the previous window. Alright, done. And now here I'll also uncomment the close because anyway it's a failure which I'm going to see, which I should be able to see it in the logs. So I'll close the browser after the execution of test case. Okay, so let's simply go and run the test case. Okay, Amazon.in is launched. It should search for iPhone now. Yeah, there you go. All right, now it should also close the browser. Yes, it has closed the browser and it has failed. Now see here. Now this is the line where our command failed. Why? Because the expected title was not there. And if you look in the logs, it says your assert title on Amazon.in failed. Actual result was something different and it did not match with what we had asked it for. So this is how simple it is to use your ID to create your automation scripts. So we saw all the components of ID. We saw the record button, then I showed you the toolbar, I showed you the editor box and also the test execution log. So now let's come to what are the limitations of this ID. With ID, you cannot export your scripts, your test scripts to WebDriver scripts. This support is not yet added, but it is in the works. Data-driven testing, like using your Excel files or reading data from the CSV files and passing it to the script, this capability is still not available. Also, you cannot connect to database for reading your test data or perform any kind of database testing. With Selenium WebDriver, yes, you can. Also, unlike Selenium WebDriver, you do not have a good reporting mechanism with the ID, like say for example, TestNG or ReportNG. So that brings us to the next component of the suite, which is Selenium RC, Selenium Remote Control. So Selenium RC was developed by Paul Hammond. He refactored the code, which was developed by Jason and was credited with Jason as a co-creator of Selenium. Selenium Server is written in Java. It is used to write web application tests in different programming languages, as it supports multiple programming languages like your Java, C#, Perl, Python and Ruby. It interacts with the browser with the help of an RC server. So this RC server uses a simple HTTP GET and POST request for communication. And as I said earlier also, Selenium RC was called as Selenium 1.0 version. But it got deprecated in Selenium 2.0 and was completely removed in 3.0, and it got replaced by what? WebDriver. And we'll see why this happened and what was that issue which we had with the RC server. So this is the architecture of Selenium remote control at a very high level. So when Jason Huggins introduced Selenium, you know the tool was called as JavaScript program. And then that was also called as a Selenium core. So every HTML has a JavaScript statements which are executed by web browser, and there is a JavaScript engine which helps in executing this command. Now this RC had one major issue. Now what was that issue? Say for example, you have a test script, say test.javascript here, which you are trying to access elements from anywhere from the google.com domain. So what used to happen is every element which is accessible are the elements which can belong only to google.com domain. Like say for example, mail, the search or the drive. So any elements from this can be accessible through your test scripts. However, nothing outside the domain of say google.com in this case was accessible. Say for example, if your test scripts wanted to access something from yahoo.com, this was not possible. And this is due to the security reasons, obviously. Now to overcome that, the testers, what they had to do was they had to install the Selenium core and the web server, which contained your web application which is under test on the same machine. And imagine if you have to do this for every machine which is under test. This is not going to be feasible or even effective all the time. And this issue is called as a same origin policy. Now what a same origin policy issue says is it prohibits a JavaScript from accessing elements or interacting with scripts from a domain different from where it is launched. And this is purely for the security measure. So if you have written a scripts which can access your google.com or anything related to google.com, these scripts cannot access any elements outside the domain, like as we said in the example yahoo.com. This was the same origin policy. Now to overcome this, what this gentleman did was he created something called as Selenium remote control server to trick the browser in believing that your core, your Selenium core and your web application under test are from the same domain. And this is what was the Selenium remote control. So if you look at again a high level architecture or how did this actually work, first you write your test scripts, which is here, right, in any of the supported language like your PHP or your Java or Python. And before we start testing, we need to launch this RC server, which is a separate application. So this Selenium server is responsible for receiving the Selenese commands. And these Selenese commands are the ones which you have written in your script. It interprets them and reports the result back to your test. So all that is done through your RC server. The browser interaction which happens through RC server, right, from here to your browser. So this happens through a simple HTTP and post and get request. And that is how your RC server and your browser communicate. And how exactly this communication happens? This RC server, it acts like a proxy. So say your test scripts ask to launch a browser. So what happens is this commands goes to your server and then your RC server launches the browser. It injects the JavaScript into the browser. Once this is done, all the subsequent calls from your test script, right, from your test scripts to your browser goes through your RC. And now upon receiving these instructions, your Selenium core executes these actual commands as JavaScript commands on the browser. And then the test results are displayed back from your browser to your RC to your test scripts. So the same cycle gets repeated, right, until the complete test case execution is over. So for every command what you write in your JavaScript here or your test script here goes through a complete cycle of going through the RC server to the browser, collecting the results again from the RC server back to your test scripts. So this cycle gets repeated for every command until your complete test execution is done. So RC had definitely a lot of shortcomings, and what are those? So RC server needs to be installed before running any test scripts, which we just saw. So that was an additional setup since it acts as a mediator between your commands, which is your Selenese commands, and your browser. The architecture of RC is complicated. Why? Because of its intermediate RC server, which is required to communicate with the browser. The execution of commands takes very long. It is slower. We know why, because every command in this takes a full trip from the test script to your RC server, to the core engine, to the browser, and then back to the same route, which makes your overall test execution very slow. Lastly, the APIs supported by RC are very redundant and confusing. So RC does have a good number of APIs. However, it is less object oriented. So they are redundant and confusing. Say for example, say if you want to write into a text box, how and when to use a type key command or just a type command is always confusing. Another example is some of the mouse commands, using a click or a mouse down. Both kind of, almost providing a similar functionality. So that is the kind of confusion which developers used to create. Hence, Selenium RC got deprecated and is no more available in latest Selenium versions. It is obsolete now. Now, to overcome these shortfalls, WebDriver was introduced. So while RC was introduced in 2004, WebDriver was introduced by Simon Stewart in 2006. It's a cross-platform testing platform, so WebDriver can run on any platform like say Linux, Windows, Mac, or even if you have a Ubuntu machine, you can run your Selenium scripts on this machine. It is a programming interface to run test cases. It is not an IDE. And how does this work actually? So test cases are created and executed using web elements or objects using the object locator and the WebDriver methods. So when I do a demo, you will understand what these WebDriver methods are and how do we locate the web elements on the web page. It does not require a core engine like RC. So it is pretty fast. Why? Because WebDriver interacts directly with the browser and it does not have that intermediate server like the RC had. So each browser, in this case, what happens is each browser has its own driver on which the application runs. And this driver is responsible to make the browser understand the commands which you will be passing from the script. Like say for example, click of a button or you want to enter some text. So through your script, you tell which browser you want to work with, say Chrome, and then the Chrome driver is responsible for interpreting your instructions and to execute it on the web application launched on the Chrome browser. So like RC, WebDriver also supports multiple programming languages in which you can write your test scripts. So another advantage of WebDriver is it supports various frameworks like TestNG, JUnit, NUnit and ReportNG. So when we talk about the limitations of WebDriver, you will appreciate how this support for various frameworks and tools help in making the Selenium a complete automation solution for web application. So let's look at the architecture of WebDriver at a high level. What is in WebDriver? So WebDriver consists of 4 major components. The first one is we have got client libraries, right? Or what we also call it as language bindings. So since Selenium supports multiple languages and you're free to use any of the supported languages to create your automation script, these libraries are made available on your Selenium website, which you need to download and then write your scripts accordingly. So let's go and see from where do we download this. So if I go to my browser, so seleniumhq.org, right? So if you're working with Selenium, this website is your Bible. So anything and everything you need to know about Selenium, right? You need to come here and use all the tabs here in this website. So right now what we are going to look at is what are those language bindings. So for that, I'll have to go to this download tab here, okay? And if you scroll down here, you will see something like Selenium client and WebDriver language bindings. And for each of the supported language of Selenium, you have a download link, right? So say for example, if you're working with Java here, what you need to do is you need to download your Java language binding. So let's go back to the presentation. So this is where your language bindings are available. Next, so Selenium provides lots of APIs for us to interact with the browser. And when we do the demo, I'll be showing you some of these APIs, right? And these are nothing but the REST APIs. And everything, whatever we do through the script happens through the REST calls. Then we have a JSON wire protocol. What is JSON? JavaScript Object Notation. It is nothing but a standard for exchanging data over the web. So for example, you want to say launch a web application through your script. So what Selenium does it creates a JSON payload and posts the request to the browser driver. That is here. And then we have this browser drivers themselves. And as I said, there is a specific driver for each browser. As you know, every tool has its own limitation. So does Selenium. So let's look at what these limitations are and if there are any workarounds for them. Cannot test mobile applications requires framework like APM. Selenium is for automating web application. It cannot handle mobile applications. Mobile applications are a little different and they need its own set of automation tool. However, what Selenium provides is a support for integrating this APM tool, which is nothing but a mobile application automation tool. And using APM and Selenium, you can still achieve mobile application automation. And when do you usually need this? When your application under test is also supported on mobile devices, you would want a mechanism to run the same test cases on web browser as well as your mobile browsers, right? So this is how you achieve it. The next limitation, so when we talked about the components of Selenium, I said that with WebDriver, we can achieve only sequential execution. However, in real-time scenario, we cannot just live with this. We need to have a mechanism to run our test cases parallelly on multiple machines as well as on multiple browsers. So though this is a limitation of WebDriver, but what Selenium offers is something called as grid, which helps us achieve this. And we will see in shortly what the Selenium grid is all about. Also, if you want to know more details as how do we work with the grid, how do you want to install that grid, so do check out our video on Simplilearn website on Selenium grid. Third limitation, so limited reporting capability. So Selenium WebDriver has a limited reporting capability. It can create basic reports, but what we definitely need is a more. So it does support some tools like say TestNG, ReportNG and even Extent reports, which you can integrate with Selenium and generate beautiful reports. Powerful, isn't it? Also, there are other challenges with Selenium, like Selenium is not very good with image testing, especially for the ones which are designed for web application automation. But then we have other tools which can be used along with Selenium like AutoIt and Securely. So if you look at all this, Selenium still provides a complete solution for your automation needs. And that's the beauty of Selenium, and that is why it makes the most popular tool of today for automation. Okay, let's do a quick comparison between the Selenium RC and the WebDriver. So RC has a very complex architecture. You know why? Because of the additional RC server. Whereas due to direct interaction with the browser, WebDriver architecture is pretty simple. Execution speed. It is slower in RC and much faster in WebDriver. Why? Because in WebDriver, we have eliminated that complete layer of Selenium server, right? That the RC server, and we established a direct communication with the browser through browser drivers. It requires an RC server to interact with the browsers. We just talked about it, and whereas WebDriver can directly interact with the browser. So RC, again, we talked about this as one of the limitations, that we have a lot of redundant APIs, which kept developers guessing as which API to use for what functionality. However, WebDriver offers pretty clean APIs to work with. RC did not offer any support for headless browser, whereas in WebDriver, you do have a support for using headless browsers. Let's see the WebDriver in action now. Now for the demo, we will use this particular use case. And what this use case says is navigate to the official Simplilearn website, then type the Selenium in search bar and click on it, and click on the Selenium 3.0 training. So we are basically searching for Selenium 3.0 training on the Simplilearn website. First, let's do the steps manually and then we will go ahead and write the automation script. So let's go to my browser. On my browser, what I'll do is let me first launch the Simplilearn website. Okay, and here what my use case step says is I need to search for Selenium and click on the search button. So once I do that, it is going to give me a complete list of all kind of Selenium trainings which is available with Simplilearn. And what I'm interested in is the Selenium 3.0 training here. Once I find this on the web page, I need to go and click on that. Alright. So this is all the steps which we are going to perform in this use case. Okay. Now, so for writing the test cases, I'll be using an IDE which is Eclipse. I've already installed my Eclipse and also I have installed Selenium in this instance of my Eclipse. Alright, so if you can see the reference library folder here, you will see all the jars which are required for the Selenium to work. Next, another prereq which is required for Selenium, and that is your driver files. Now every browser which you want to work with has its own driver file to execute your Selenium scripts. And since for this demo I'll be working with the Firefox browser, I will need a driver file for Firefox. Now driver file for Firefox is the Gecko driver, which I have already downloaded and placed in my folder called drivers. Now where did I download this from? Let's go ahead and see that. So if I go back to my browser, and if you go to your seleniumhq.website, you have to go to this download tab here. In the download tab, when you scroll down, you will see something like third-party drivers, bindings and plugins. In this, you will see the list of all the browsers which is supported by Selenium. And against each of this browser, you will find a link which has the driver files. Now, since we'll be using the Gecko driver, this is the link where you need to go to, and depending on which operating system which you're working on, you need to download that particular file. Now, since I'm working on Mac, this is the file which I'm using. If you're a Windows user, you need to download this zip file and unzip it. So once you unzip that, you would get a file called Gecko driver for your Firefox or a Chrome driver for your Chrome browser. And then what you do is you just create a directory called drivers under your project and just place the driver files here. So these are the two prereqs for your Selenium. One is importing your jar files like this, and then having your drivers downloaded and keep them under a folder where you can reference to. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and create a class. I already have a package created in this project, so I'll use this project and create a new class. So I'll say create new Java class, and let's call this as search training. I'll be using a public static void main, and I'll click on finish. So let's remove this auto generated lines as we do not need them. Alright, now the first statement which you need to write before even you start writing the rest of your code is what you need to do is you need to define or declare your driver variable using your class WebDriver. So what I would do is I'll say WebDriver driver. Done. Alright. Now you will see that this ID is going to flash some errors for you. That means it is going to ask you to import certain libraries which is required by the WebDriver. So simply just go ahead and say import WebDriver from org.opensq.selenium. This is the package which we will need. Alright. So you have a driver created which is of the class WebDriver. And now after this I'm going to create three methods. Alright. So first method I will have for launching the Firefox browser. Okay. And then I will write a simple method for searching Selenium training and clicking on it. This is the actual use case what we'll be doing. And then third method I'm going to write is just to close the browser which I'm going to be opening, right? So these are the different methods which I'll be creating, and from the public static void main I will just call these methods one after the other. Okay, so let's go ahead and write the first method. Now my first method is launching the Firefox browser. So I'll say public void, since my return type is null or there is no return type for this, let's call it as launch browser. Okay, all right. Now in this, for launching any browser, I need to mention two steps. Now the first step is where I need to do a system.set property. Okay, let's do that first and then I'll explain what this does. I'll just say system.set property. So this accepts a key and a value pair. So what is my key here? My key here is webdriver.gecko.driver, and I need to provide a value. So value is nothing but the path to the Gecko driver. And we know that this Gecko driver which I'm going to use here is right here in the same project path under the drivers folder, correct? And that is what the path which I'm going to provide here. So here simply I need to say drivers/Gecko driver. It's Gecko. All right, done. And let me close this sentence. All right. Now, since I'm a Mac user, my Gecko driver installable is just the name Gecko driver. If you're a Windows user and if you're running your Selenium scripts on the Windows machine, you need to provide a complete path to this, including .exe, because driver executable on your machines is going to be gecko driver.exe. All right. So just make sure that your path which you mentioned here in the system.set property is the correct path. Okay. Then the next thing what we need to do is I need to just say driver is equal to new Firefox driver. Okay, so this command, new Firefox driver, creates an instance of the Firefox browser. Now this is also flagging me error. Why? Because again it's going to ask me to import the packages where the Firefox driver class is present. Okay, we did that. Now these two lines are responsible for launching the Firefox browser form. So this is done. So what's my next step in the use case? Now I need to launch the website SimplyLearn. So for that we have a command called driver.get. Driver.get, what it does is, whatever URL you're going to give it here in this double quotes as an argument, it is going to launch that particular website. And for us, it's a SimplyLearn website. So what I do as a best practice is, instead of typing out the URL, I go to my browser, launch that URL which I want to test, and I simply copy it. Come back to your Eclipse and just simply paste it. So this ensures that I do not make any mistakes in the URL. Okay, so done. So our first method is ready, where we are launching the browser, which is our Firefox browser, and then launching the SimplyLearn website. Now, the next method. What is my next method? In my next method, I need to give the search string to search Selenium training on this particular website. Now, for that, we need to do few things. What are those few things? Let's go to the website again. All right, so let me relaunch this. Let's close this. Okay, let me remove all this and let's go to the home page first. Okay, this is my home page. So as you saw, when I did a manual testing of this, I entered the text here. So now since I have to write a script for this, first I need to identify what this element is. For that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say right click here and I'll say inspect element. Alright, now this element, let's see what attribute it has which I can use for finding this element. So I see that there is an ID present. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply use this ID and then I'll just copy this ID from here. Go back to Eclipse. Let's write a method first. So I'll say public void, and what do we give the method name? Say search training or just search. All right. Now in this, I need to use a command called driver.findElement by ID is what I'm going to use as a locating technique. And in double quotes, the ID which I copied from the website is what I'm going to paste here. Okay. And then what am I going to do on this element is, I need to send that text, the text which I'm going to search for, which is Selenium. So I'll just say send keys, and whatever text I want to send, I need to give it in double quotes. So for that, Selenium. So this is done. So now I've entered the text here, and after entering the text, I need to click on this button. So for that, I need to first know what that button is. So let's inspect that search button. Okay. Now, if you look at the search button, other than the tag, which is span, and the class name, I do not have anything here. All right. So what I can do is I can either use the class name or I can write an XPath. Since this is a demo, which we have already used ID locating technique, I would go ahead and use the XPath here. So for me to construct an XPath, I will copy this class first. Okay. And then I already have a crow path installed on my Firefox. So I'll use the crow path and first test my XPath. So I'll just say /. Let's see what was that element. It has a span tag. Okay, so I'll have to use span and at class equal to, and I'll just copy the class name here. And let's see if it can identify that element. Yeah, so it is able to identify. So I'll just use this XPath in my code. So I'll go back to Eclipse and I'll say driver.findElement by.xpath. And the XPath which I just copied from crowpath is what I'm going to paste here. And what is the action I need to do here? I need to say click. Done. So I have reached a stage where I have entered this Selenium. Okay. And then I have clicked on the search button. Once I do this, I know that expected result is I should be able to find this particular link here, Selenium 3.0 training. Okay. And I should be able to click on that. So for that, again, I need to inspect this. So let's inspect this Selenium 3.0. Alright, so now what are the elements this has? Now this particular element has attributes like it has a tag h2, then it has got some class name and some other attributes. So I would like to use a XPath here. Now this time while using the XPath, I'm going to make use of a text functionality so that I can search for this particular text. So I'll simply copy this. I'll go to my crow path. The tag is h2. So I'll say simply h2. Okay, and here I'll say text equal to, and this is the text which I copied. I missed out that yes there, so I'm just going to add an S. Okay, so let's first test here whether it is able to identify that element. Yeah, so it is able to identify. So can you see a blue dotted line? It is able to show us which element it is identified. So I'll copy this XPath now and let's go to my IDE Eclipse So now here what I need to do is I'll have to again simply say driver dot find element by dot xpath and paste the xpath which we just did, and then again I have to do a click operation. Done. Alright. So technically we have taken all the steps of the use case and we have written the commands for that. Alright. Now let's add an additional thing here. Say after coming to this page, after finding this, we want to say print the title of this page. Now what is the title of this page? If you just hover your mouse on this, it says online and classroom training for professional certification courses simply learn. So what I will do is after doing all these operations, I will just print out this page title on our console. So for that I have to just do this driver dot so let's do a sysout. So I'll say sysout system.out.println. Okay, and here I would say let's add a text here. The page title is, and then let's append it with driver dot get title. So this is the command which we'll be using to fetch the page title. Done. Now what is the last method I need to add? Just to close the browser. Alright, so let me add a method here. I'll say public void close browser, and it's a one single command which I need to call. I'll say driver dot quit. Okay, and then I need to call all these methods from my public static void main. So let me use my class name, which is this. So I'm going to create an object obj is equal to new class name, and then using this object, first is I need to call the method launch browser, and then I'll call the method search, right, and then I'll call the method close browser. Done. So technically our script is ready with all the functionality which we wanted to cover from our use case. Now there are few other tweaks which I need to do this, and I'll tell you why I need to do this. Now for example, after we click here, right, after we click on the search, if you observed on your website, it took a little while before it listed out all the Selenium trainings for us. And usually when you're actually doing it, you wait for the Selenium 3.0 training to be available and then you click on that. Now same thing, you also need to tell your scripts to do that. You need to tell your scripts to wait for a while until you start seeing the Selenium 3.0 training or it appears on your web page. There are multiple ways to do that in your script, and it is a part of overall synchronization, what we call, where we use kind of implicit and explicit kind of ways. Now since this is a demo, for demo purpose, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a command called thread.sleep, and I'm just going to give an explicit wait of say 3 seconds. So you can use this mainly for the demo purposes. You can use a thread.sleep command. Now this thread.sleep command needs us to handle some exceptions. So I'm just going to click on add throws declaration and say interrupted exception. Now same thing, I'll have to do it in my main function also. Okay, so let's do that and complete it. Alright, so this is done. So by doing this, what am I doing? I'm ensuring that before I click on the Selenium 3.0 training, we are giving enough time for the script to wait until the web page shows this link to the Selenium 3.0 training. That's one thing I'm doing. Alright, and also now since you're going to be seeing this demo through the video recording, the script when it starts running, it is going to be very fast. So you might just miss out seeing how it does the send keys and how did it click on the search button. For us to enable us to see it properly, I'll just add some explicit waits here just for our demo purpose. So after entering the keys, right, so what I'll do is I'll just give a simple thread.sleep here. Okay, so probably a 3 seconds or a 2 seconds wait should be good enough. Okay, a 3 seconds wait should be good enough here so that we should be able to see how exactly this works on your browser when we execute this. Okay, now our complete script is ready. So what I'll do is I'll just save the script and then we will simply run the script. So to run the script, I'll just say right click, run as Java application. Okay, it says asks me to select and save. I've saved the script now. So let's observe how it runs. Okay, the simplylearn.com, the website is launched. So the Selenium text has been entered in the search box. It is clicked on the search. Okay, all right. So now it did everything whatever we wanted it to do. All right. So since we are closing the browser, you were unable to see whether the Selenium 3.0 training was selected or not. However, what I have given here is to fetch the title after all these operations were complete. And if you see here, the complete operations was done and we were able to see the page title here. Okay. So now what I'll do, since we are unable to see whether it clicked on the Selenium 3.0 training or not, I'll just comment out the close browser, the command. Okay, so we will not call the close browser so that the browser remains open and we get to see whether did it really find the training link or not. Okay, so let me close this window. We don't need this Firefox window. Close all tabs, and then I'll just re-execute this script. So I'll say run as Java application. So save the file. Okay, simplylearn.com is launched. So search text is entered. Now it's going to click on the search button. Yes. Alright, so we've got the search results. It should click on Selenium 3.0 training, and yes, it is successfully able to click on that. Alright, so now it's not going to close the browser because we have commented on that line. However, it did print us the title here. Alright, so this is a simple way of using the Selenium scripts. Selenium Grid. So Grid is used to run multiple test scripts on multiple machines at the same time. With WebDriver, you can only do sequential execution, but in real-time environment, you always have the need to run test cases in distributed environment, and that is where Selenium Grid comes into picture. So Grid was conceptualized and developed by Patrick. The main objective is to minimize test execution time, and how? By running your test parallelly. So design is in such a way that commands are distributed on multiple machines where you want to run test, and all these are executed simultaneously. What do you achieve by this methodology? Of course, the parallel execution on different browsers and operating systems. Grid is pretty flexible and can integrate with many tools. Like say you want a reporting tool integrated to pull all the reports from the multiple machines where you're running your test cases, and you want to present that report in a good looking format. So you have an option to integrate such report. Okay, so how does this grid work? So grid has a hub and node concept which helps in achieving the parallel execution. Let's take an example. Say your application supports all browsers and most of the operating system. Like as in this picture, you could say one of them is a Windows machine, one of them is a Mac machine, and another one is say a Linux machine. So your requirement is to run the test on all supported browsers and operating systems, like the one which is depicted in this picture. So what you have to do is, first thing is you configure a master machine, or what you also call it as a hub, by running something called a Selenium standalone server. And this standalone server can be downloaded from the Selenium HQ website. Using this server, you create a hub configuration, that is this node. And then you create nodes specific to your machine requirement. And how are these nodes created? You again use the same server, which is your standalone Selenium server, to create the node configuration. So I'll show you where the Selenium server can be downloaded. So if we go back to our Selenium HQ website, so you can see here right on the top, it says Selenium standalone server. And this is the latest version available, so you just need to download. Once you download this, keep a version of this one on your master machine, that is your hub, and this should also be present on your node machines. And there is a certain command which you can use to install this server as a node and as a master depending on your configuration. So once that is done, you have your master or the hub and the nodes created. Your master can control on which nodes you want to execute test. Now say if this is a Mac machine, this is a Windows machine, through your master or your hub, you control on which machine you want to execute what tests. Then also you could have a multiple combination of tests. Like say for example, smoke test to be run on all these nodes. That's the kind of configuration you can create. Or a certain component test to be run on say only Windows 10 with an Edge browser. Or say regression test on Mac machine. So any such things, whatever configurations you have for your node, what happens is the hub picks the right node which conforms to your requirements or the configurations which you have set up, and then sends a command to the node to execute those test cases on the node. Everything is controlled through your master machine only here. What happens on the node? So once the node gets the command from the master, the node actually runs all the test cases which it intends to run on the specific browser which you have mentioned in your configuration file. So this is a very high level architecture and how a grid works. So if you want to know more details of how the grid works, you can refer to our video on Simplilearn. Alright, again limitations. So what limitation does this grid have now? The first one, it has relatively poor scalability compared to many modern applications. It is pretty static. Each server is configured in advance with a subset of required browser instances available. So if you want to vary this, you'll need to reconfigure. So any configuration tomorrow on any machines you want to change, it cannot be done automatically. You need to completely reconfigure that node and then add it back to the grid. Thirdly, although it is available to run on virtual servers, it is actually not designed as a cloud native application. And as a result of this, it isn't optimized to take advantage of things like, say, distributed storage or dynamic scaling or even automatic failover. So these are some of the limitations of the grid. Advantages of Selenium: speed and accuracy. Of course, since there is no manual execution, your test can run faster, and with grid, it helps in parallel execution, and you can run or execute large volumes of tests within a very short time frame. Let's take an example. Say just before the release of your product, say during the last lap of your testing, you find a bug, and of course it has to be fixed. So the developer fixes the bug and you want to run all the test cases pertaining to that area. Now, can you imagine that if you have to do this testing manually, how long it's going to take? So by automation, you can achieve this in a very short duration of time, and it will also help you release your product in time with very minimal or absolutely no human errors. The second advantage, it's an open source, so it's available free of cost, so anyone can download it and start using it. It supports wide spectrum of programming languages we have been seeing throughout this presentation. It is not restricted to any particular programming language. So whatever language you are comfortable with, you have an option to use that and write your Selenium scripts. Selenium has support for almost all browsers and operating systems. We also talked about headless browser support. So this helps you create test cases once using any of the browser and run them across all browsers and all operating systems, thus saving you a lot of time from manual execution and helping in achieving a very broad test coverage. And we also saw that pretty easy to use tool, right? So you can check out all our videos and it's just a matter of time that you can master the skill of writing your automation scripts. Reusability. Of course, like any programming language, it provides you a mechanism to reuse your code and avoid redundancy. Well, again, let's see an overall what are the limitations of Selenium itself. Now, since Selenium is open source, that is one of the biggest advantage. Now, there is a little disadvantage which comes with that. And what is it? You do not have much technical support because it's an open source code. However, there are loads and loads of documentations and forums available which you can definitely refer to. And Selenium, as we said, it is only for automating web applications. It cannot handle the mobile applications or even the desktop application. However, it does provide support for integrating tools like APM for mobile testing. Selenium is not very good with image testing, especially designed for your web application tools. Again, we have tools like AutoIt and Sequely which can be integrated with Selenium. Selenium WebDriver has limited reporting capability, but again, it does provide us support for integrating tools like TestNG, ReportNG, and Extend Report. It does not have test management capabilities. It need not, right? Not one tool need not have each and everything what is required, but there is always a way to integrate it. So Selenium does provide a way to integrate any of the test management tools. Now, since Selenium supports multiple programming languages, the developer of test automation will require to have some basic knowledge of any of the programming language it supports to write effective automation scripts. Right? So this you could look at it as an advantage or as a disadvantage. So overall, if you look at all this, right, Selenium still provides a complete solution for our automation need. And that is why we can still say that Selenium is one of the most popular tool used in the industry today for your web application automation.
Today we're going to go through interview questions that you are likely to be asked if you are interviewing for a job that focuses on DevOps. So there are approximately 7 sections that we cover in DevOps. We go from general DevOps questions, source code management with tools such as Git, continuous integration, and here we'll focus on Jenkins, continuous testing with tools such as Selenium, and then you also have the operations side of DevOps, which is your configuration management with tools such as Chef, Puppet, and Ansible, containerization with Docker, and then continuous monitoring with tools such as Nagios. So let's just get into those general general DevOps questions. So one of the questions that you're going to be asked is, how is DevOps different from Agile? And the reality is that DevOps is a cultural way of being able to deliver solutions that's different from Agile. If we look at the evolution of delivery over the last 5 to 10 years, we've gone from waterfall based delivery to Agile delivery, which is on sprints, to where we are with continuous integration and continuous delivery around DevOps. The whole concept of DevOps is culturally very, very different from Agile. And the difference is that you're looking at being able to do continuous releases. What does that mean? The difference is that you want to be able to send out code continuously to your production environment. That means the operations team, the development team have to be working together. That means that any code that gets created has to be able to go to production very quickly, which means you need to be testing your code continuously. And then that production environment must also be able to be tested continuously, and any changes or any errors that come up have to be communicated effectively and efficiently back to the dev and op team. Another area in which I see that DevOps is different is really the response that we have for how we engage with the customer. So the customer is coming to your website, to your mobile app, to your chatbot, or any digital solution that you have, and has an expectation. When you're going through and actually doing a DevOps paradigm, the old model would be that you would capture requirements from the customer, then you do your development, then you do your testing, and there would be these barriers between each of those. As we move faster through from waterfall to Agile, what we saw is that with Agile, we were able to respond much faster to customer demands. So instead of it being weeks or months, sometimes in some cases years between releases of software, what we saw was a transition to weeks and months for releases on software. Now we see with DevOps is that the release cycle has shrunk even further, with the goal of continuously delighting the customer. How further has that release cycle shrunk to? There are companies that have gone from having releases of once a week or once every 2 weeks or once a month to now having multiple releases a day. Indeed, some companies have up to 50 releases a day. This isn't something to also bear in mind, is that each of those releases are tested and verified against test records so that you can guarantee that the code that's going to production is going to be good continuous code. So what are the differences between the different phases of DevOps? So effectively, there are two main phases of DevOps. There's the planning and coding phase, and then there's the deploying phase. And you have a tool such as Jenkins that allows you to integrate between both environments. Some of the core benefits that you may have to DevOps are going to be some technical benefits and some business benefits. So when somebody asks you what are the benefits of DevOps, you can reply that from a technical point of view, you're able to use continuous software delivery to constantly push out code that has been tested and verified against scripts that have been written and approved. You can be able to push out smaller chunks of code so that when you have an issue, you're not having to go through massive blocks of code or massive projects. You're going through just very small microservices or small sections of code, and you're able to detect and correct problems faster. On the business side, the benefits are absolutely fantastic. From a customer that's coming to your website or to your mobile app, they're going to see responses happening continuously so that the customer is always aware that you as a company are listening to their demands and responding appropriately. You're able to provide a more stable environment, and you're able to scale that environment to the demands of the number of customers that are using your services. So how will you approach a project that needs to implement DevOps? So this is really an exciting area for you to be in. So there are effectively 3 stages when it comes to actually working in a DevOps. The first stage is an assessment stage, and think of this as the back of the napkin ideation stage. This is where you are sitting with a business leader and they're giving you ideas of what they would like to see from feedback that they've had from their customers. This is blue sky opportunity. This is thinking of big ideas. That second stage, and this often comes as a fast follow to stage 1, is actually proving out that concept. So developing a proof of concept. concept. And a proof of concept can actually be multiple different things. So it could be something as simple as a wireframe, or it could be something that is as complex as a mini version of the final application. Depending on the scope of the work that you're delivering will really depend on how complicated you want the POC to be. But with that in mind, whatever choice you make, you have to be able to deliver enough in the POC so that when you present this to a customer, they're able to respond to that creation that you've developed and able to give you feedback to be able to validate that you are going with the right solution and able to provide the right product to your customers. That third stage is where you get into your DevOps stage. And this is just the exciting part. This is where the rubber hits the road and you start releasing code based on a backlog of features that are being requested for the solution. In contrast to doing agile delivery where you just continuously work through a backlog, with DevOps, what you're also looking at is putting in analytics and sensors to be able to validate that you are being successful with the solution that's being delivered. So that once you actually start delivering out code that customers can interact with, you want to be able to see what are the pieces of the solution that they are using, what do they like, what is complicated, where are the failure points, and you want to use that data and feed that back into your continuous integration and have that as a means to be able to backfill the demand of work that gets completed in the backlog. So what is the difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment? So continuous delivery is based on putting out code that can be deployed safely to production. It ensures that your businesses and functions are running as you would expect them to be. So it's going through and completing the code that you'd actually see. Continuous deployment, in contrast, is all about ensuring that you're automating the deployment of a production environment. So you're able to go through and scale up your environment to meet the demands of both the solution and the customer. This makes software development and release processes much more faster and more robust. So if we look here, we can actually see where continuous integration and continuous deployment come hand in hand. So when you actually start out with the initial pushes of your code, that's where you're doing your continuous integration and your continuous delivery. And then at some point, you want to get very comfortable with deploying the code that you're creating so that it's being pushed out to your production environment. One of the things that's great about working with the tools that you use in a DevOps continuous integration and continuous delivery model is that the development tools that you use, the containerization tools, the testing tools, should always reflect the production environment. And what this means is that when you actually come to deploying solutions to production, there are no surprises because your development team have been working against that exact same environment all the way through. So a question that you'll also be asked is, what is the role of the configuration management in DevOps? And so the role of configuration management really has three distinct areas. The first, and this is really the obvious one, and this is the one where you probably already have significant experiences, is the ability to manage and handle large changes to multiple systems in seconds rather than days, hours, or weeks, as may have happened before. The second area is that you want to also demonstrate the business reasons for having configuration management. And the business reason here is that it allows IT and infrastructure to standardize on resource configurations. And this has a benefit in that you're able to do more with fewer people. So instead of having a large configuration team, you can actually have a smaller, more highly skilled team that's able to actually manage an even larger operational environment. And thirdly, you want to be able to highlight the ability to scale. So if you have configuration management tools, you're able to manage a significant number of servers and domains that may have multiple servers in. It allows you to effectively manage servers that are deployed on cloud or private cloud and allow you to do this with high accuracy. So how does continuous monitoring help in maintain the entire architecture of the system? So when this question comes up, you want to dig in and show your knowledge on how configuration and continuous monitoring is able to control an entire environment. So the number one topic that you want to bring up when it comes to continuous monitoring is that with being able to effectively monitor your entire network 24/7 for any changes as they happen, you're able to identify and report those faults or threats immediately and respond immediately for your entire network, instead of having to wait, as it happens sometimes, for a customer to email or call you and say, hey, your website's down. Nobody wants that. That's an embarrassing thing. The other three areas that you want to be able to highlight are the ability to be able to ensure that the right software and the right services are running on the right resources. That's your number one takeaway that you want to be able to give of continuous monitoring. The second is to be able to monitor the status of those servers continuously. This is not requiring manually monitoring, but having an agent that's monitoring those servers continuously. And then the third is that by scripting out and continuously monitoring your entire environment, you're creating a self-audit trail that you can take back and demonstrate the effectiveness of the operations environment that you are providing. So one of the cloud companies that is a strong advocate for DevOps is Amazon's Web Services, AWS, and they have really 5 distinct areas that you can zero in on for services. So when the question comes up, what is the role of AWS in DevOps? You want to really hold out your hand and list off 5 areas of focus using your thumb and finger. So you want to have flexible services, built for scale, automation, secure, and a large partner ecosystem. And having those 5 areas will really be able to help demonstrate why you believe that AWS and other cloud providers, but AWS is certainly the leader in this space, are great for being able to provide support for the role of DevOps. So one of the things that we want to be able to do effectively when we're releasing any kind of solution is to be able to measure that solution. And so KPIs are very important. So you will be asked for 3 important DevOps KPIs. And so 3 that really come to mind that are very effective. The first one is mean time to failure recovery. And what this talks about is what is the average time does it take to recover from a failure? And if you have experience doing this, then look at the experience you have and use a specific example where you are able to demonstrate that mean time to failure recovery. The second is deployment frequency. And with deployment frequency, you want to be able to discuss how often do you actually deploy solutions and what actually happens when you're actually doing those deployments, and what does the impact to your network look like when you're doing those deployments. And then the third one is really tied to that deployment frequency, which is around what is the percentage of failed deployments. So how many times did you deploy to a server and something happened where the server itself failed? What we're looking for when you're going through and being asked for these KPIs is experience with actually doing a DevOps deployment and being able to understand what DevOps looks like when you're pushing out your infrastructure. And then the second is being able to validate that self-auditing ability. And one word of caution is don't go in there and say that you have 100% success. The reality is that servers do degrade over time, and you maybe want to talk about a time when a server did degrade in your environment and use that as a story for how you were able to successfully get over and solve that degradation. So one of the terms that is very popular at the moment is infrastructure as code. And so you're going to be asked to explain infrastructure as code. And really, it's something that actually becomes a byproduct of the work you have to do when you're actually putting together your DevOps environment. And infrastructure as code really refers to the writing of code to actually manage your environment. And you can go through many of the other tools that we've covered in this series, but you'll see that XML or Ruby or YAML are used as languages to describe the configuration for your environment. This allows you to then create create the rules and instructions that can be read by the machines that are actually setting up the physical hardware versus a traditional model, which is having software and installing that software directly onto the machine. This is really important when it comes to cloud computing. There really is a strong emphasis of being able to explain infrastructure as a service, and infrastructure as code is fundamental to the foundation to infrastructure as service. And then finally, it allows you to be able to talk about how you can use scripted languages such as YAML to be able to create a consistent experience for your entire network. All right, so let's now get into the next section, which is source code management. And we're going to focus specifically on Git. The reason being is that Git is really the most popular source code management solution right now. There are other technologies out there, but for the types of distributed environments that we have, source code management with Git is probably the most effective. So the first question you'll be asked when it comes to Git is to talk about the difference between centralized and distributed version control. And if we look at the way that the two are set up, older technologies such as older versions of Team Foundation Server, though the current version does actually have Git in it, but older versions required a centralized server for you to check in and check out of code. The developer in the centralized system does not have all the files for the application, and if the centralized server crashes, then you actually lose all of the history of your code. Now, in contrast, a distributed model, actually we do check in our code to a server. However, for you to be effective and building out your solution, you actually check out all of the code for the solution directly onto your local development machine. So you can actually have a copy of the entire solution running on your local machine. This allows you to be able to work effectively offline. It really allows for scalability when it comes to building out your team. So if you have a team that may be in Europe, you can actually then scale that team with people from Asia, from North America or South America very easily, and not have to worry about whether or not they have the right code or the wrong code. And in addition to that, if the actual main server where you're checking in your code does crash, it's not a big deal because you actually have, each person has a copy of the code. So as soon as the server comes back up, you're able to check back in and everybody's running back as if there was nothing had happened at all. So one of the questions you'll be asked is to give the answer to some of the commands you use for working with Git. So if you were to be asked a question is, what is the Git command that downloads any repository from GitHub to your computer? On the screen we have four options. We have Git push, Git fork, Git clone, and Git commit. The answer in this instance would be Git clone. Now, if you want to be able to push code from your local system to a GitHub repository using Git, then first of all, you want to be able to do is connect the local repository to a remote repository. And in the example, you may want to talk about using the command git remote add origin and then the actual path to a GitHub repository. You could, if you wanted to, actually at this point also talk about other repositories such as GitLab that you can also work with, or a private Git repository that would be used just for the development team. Once you've actually then added the local repository into your local computer, then the second action you want to use is a push, which is to actually push your local files out to the master environment. So you use the command git push origin master. So one question you may be asked is, what is the difference between a bare repository and a standard way of initializing a Git repository? So let's look through what is the standard way. So the standard way using git init allows you to create a working directory using the command git init. And then the folder that creates is the folder that creates all the revision history related to the work that you're doing. In contrast, using the bare way, you have a different commands for setting that up. So it would be git init --bare, and it does not contain any working or checked out source files locally on your machine. In addition, the revision history is actually stored in the root folder versus a subfolder that you would have with the normal git init initialization. So which of the following CLI commands would you be used to rename a file? So we have git rm, git mv, git rm-r, or none of the above? Well, in this instance, it would be git mv. A question that you'll be asked around commit is going to be, what is the process to revert a commit that has already been pushed and made public? And there are two ways you can address this. The first is to actually address the bad file in the new commit, and you can use the command git commit -m and then put in a comment for why that file is being removed. The second is to actually create a new commit that actually undoes all the changes that were made with the bad commit. And then to do that, you would use git revert and then the commit ID, and the commit ID could be something such as 56DE0938F, but you'd have to find that from the commit that you had made, but that would allow you to revert any bad files that you had submitted. So there are two ways of being able to get files from a Git repository, and you're going to be asked to explain the difference between git fetch and git pull. So git fetch allows you to fetch and download only new data from a new repository. It does not integrate any of the new data into your working files, and it can be undone at any time if you wanted to break out the remote tracking branches. In contrast, git pull updates the current head branch with the latest changes from the remote server. So you get all of the files downloaded. It downloads new data and integrates it with the current working files you have on your system, and it tries to merge remote changes with your local ones. So one of the questions you'll get asked about Git is, what is a Git stash? So as a developer, you will be working on the current branch within a solution. But what happens if you come up with an idea where it's something that will take a different amount of time for you to be able to complete, but you don't want to interrupt the mainline branch? So what you can actually do is you can actually create a branch that allows you to start working on your own work outside of the mainline branch. And this is called Git stash. It allows you to be able to modify your files without interrupting the mainline branch. So once you start talking about branching in Git, be prepared to answer and explain the concept of branching. So essentially what it allows you to do is have a mainline master branch that has all the code that the team is checking in and checking out against, but allows you to have an indefinite number of branches that allows for new features to be built in parallel to the mainline branch, and then at some point be reintroduced to the mainline branch to allow the team to add in new features. And so if we look through the merge and git rebase, these are the two features that you'd be using continuously to be able to talk about how you take a branch and merge it back into the mainline branch. So on the left hand side we have git merge, which allows you to take the code that you're creating and merge it back into the master. On the right hand side what you have is a slightly different approach. This is for projects where you reach a point in a project where you go, okay, we're going to effectively restart the project at this point in time, and we want to ignore the complete history that's happened before that, and that's called git rebase, and that would allow you to rewrite the project history by creating a brand new mainline branch that ignores all other previous branches that have happened before it. You can, if you want to, very quickly and easily find out all the files that have been used to make a particular commit. So when somebody asks you the question, how do you find a list of files that has been changed in a particular commit, you can actually say that all you have to go is find the command git diff-tree-r and then the hash that you would use for the commit, and that would actually then give you a breakdown of all the files that have been made with that particular commit. A question that you'll be asked when you're talking about merging files is, what is a merge conflict in Git and how can it be resolved? So essentially a merge conflict is when you have two or more branches that are competing with commits in Git, and you have to be able to determine which is the appropriate files that need to be submitted. And this is where you would go in, and to actually help resolve this issue, you'd actually go in and manually edit the conflicted files to select the changes you want to keep in the final merge. So let me go through the steps that you would take to be able to illustrate this when you're talking about this particular question in your interview. There are essentially 4 stages. The first would be under the repository name, you want to select a pull request, and you want to be able to show how that pull request would be demonstrated inside of GitHub. So within the pull request, there's going to be a highlight of conflict markers, and you'll be able to select which conflicts you want to keep and which you want to merge and which ones you want to change. So it's a step through how you would actually resolve a merge conflict. The first step would be under GitHub. You want to be able to pull the repository name and then the pull request around that repository. In the pull request list, click the pull request with a merge conflict and that you'd like to be able to resolve. That will pull up a file that will list out all of the conflicts for you. Near the bottom of that file will be a list of the requests that need to be resolved. And then if you need to make a decision on which branches you want to keep or which ones you want to change, that will have to be something you have to put in instructions inside of the file. You'll actually see that there are conflict markers within the instructions which are going to ask you which files you want to change and which ones you want to keep. If you have more than one merge conflict in your file, scroll down to the next set of conflict markers and repeat steps 4 and 5 until you resolve all of the conflicts. You will want to mark your file as resolved in GitHub so that the repository knows that you are having everything resolved. If you have more than one file with a conflict, then you want to go then onto the next file and start working on those files and just keep repeating the steps we've done up to this point until you have all of the conflicts resolved. And then once you have all of the resolutions created, then you want to select the button which is commit merge and then merge all your files back into GitHub, and this will take care and manage the resolution of the merge conflict within GitHub. So you can also do this through command line, and with the command line you want to use git bash, and so you want to, as a first step, open up git bash and then navigate to the local git repository in command line using the cd change directory, and then list out the actual folder where you actually are putting all of your code. And then you want to be able to generate a list of the files that are affected with the merge conflict. And in this instance here, you can actually see the file styleguide.md has a merge conflict in it. And as before, with working with GitHub, you actually go through and use a text editor, and you can use any text editor. But as you go through and edit out what you want to keep and what you want to manage in your conflict, so you actually have a resolution that's being created, so that you'll be able to then, once you're using the conflict markers, you can actually merge your files together so that the solution itself will allow you to incorporate your commits effectively into the resolution. Once you've gone through and applied your changes, you're able to then merge the conflicted commits into a single commit and able to push that up to your remote repository. All right, let's talk about the next section, which is continuous integration with Jenkins. So the first question you'll be asked about with Jenkins is explain a master-slave architecture of Jenkins. So the way that Jenkins is set up is that the Jenkins master will pull code from your remote Git repository such as GitHub and will check that repository every time there is a code commit. It will distribute the workload of that code and the tests that need to be applied to that code to all of the Jenkins slaves. And then on request, the Jenkins master and the slaves will then carry out all the builds and tests to be able to produce test reports. The next question you'll be asked is, what is a Jenkins file? And simply put, a Jenkins file is a text file that has a definition of the Jenkins pipeline and is checked into a source code repository. And this really allows for 3 distinct things to happen. One, it allows for a code review and iteration of the pipeline. It permits an audit trail for that pipeline and also provides a single source of truth for the pipeline, which can be viewed and edited. So which of the following commands runs Jenkins from the command line? Is it java-jar jenkins.war, java-war jenkins.jar, java-jar jenkins.jar, java-war jenkins.war? And the answer is A, java-jar jenkins.war. So when working with Jenkins, you're going to be asked what are the key concepts and aspects of working with a Jenkins pipeline. And you want to really hold out your fingers here and go through 4 key areas, and that is pipeline, node, step, and stage. So pipeline refers to the user-defined model of a CD continuous delivery pipeline. Node are the machines which are part of that Jenkins environment within the pipeline. Step is a single task that tells Jenkins what to do at that particular point in time. And then finally, stage defines a conceptually distinct subset of tasks performed through the entire pipeline. And tasks could be build, test, and deploy. So which of the following file is used to define dependency in Maven? And do we have A, build.xml, B, pom.xml, C, dependency.xml, or D, version.xml? And the answer is pom.xml. Working with Jenkins, you're going to be asked to explain the two types of pipeline used in Jenkins along with the syntax. And so a scripted pipeline is based on GroovyScript as their domain-specific language for Jenkins. And there are one or more node blocks that are used throughout the entire pipeline. On the left-hand side, you can actually see what the actual script would look like, and the right-hand side shows what the actual declaration for each section of that script would be. The second type of Jenkins pipeline is a declarative pipeline. And a declarative pipeline provides a simple and a friendly syntax to define what the pipeline should look like. And then you can actually, at this point, use an example to actually break out how blocks are used to define the work completed in a declarative pipeline. So how do you create a copy and backup of Jenkins? Well, to create a backup, periodically back up Jenkins to your Jenkins home directory, and then create a copy of that directory. It's really as simple as that. A question you'll be asked as well is how can you copy Jenkins from one server to another? Well, there are three ways to do that. One is you can move a job from one installation of Jenkins to another by copying the corresponding job directory. The second would be to create a copy of an existing job directory and making a clone of that job directory but with a different name. And the third is to rename an existing job by renaming a directory. So security is fundamental to all the work that we do within DevOps, and Jenkins provides the center core to all the work that gets completed within a DevOps environment. There are three ways in which you can apply security to authenticate users effectively. And when you are asked about this question of security within Jenkins, the three responses you want to be able to provide is A, Jenkins has its own internal database that uses secured user data and user credentials. B is you can use a LDAP or lightweight directory access protocol server to be able to authenticate Jenkins users. Or C, you can actually configure Jenkins to authenticate by using such as OAuth, which is a more modern method of being able to authenticate users. You're going to be asked how to deploy a custom build of a core plugin within Jenkins. And essentially, the 4 steps that you want to go through are, first of all, copying the .hpi plugin file into the Jenkins home plugins subdirectory. You want to remove the plugin's development directory if there is one. You want to create an empty file called plugin.hpi.pinned. And once you've completed these 3 steps, restart Jenkins and your custom build plugin should be available. How can you temporarily turn off Jenkins security if the administrative user has locked themselves out of the admin console? Well, this doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's good to know how you can actually get into Jenkins and be able to resolve the problems of authenticating effectively into the system as an administrator. So when you want to be able to get into a Jenkins environment, what you want to be able to do is locate the config file. You should see that it's set to true, which allows for security to be enabled. If you then change the user security setting to false, security will be disabled, allowing you to make your administrative changes and will not be re-enabled until the next time Jenkins is restarted. So what are the ways in which a build can be scheduled and run in Jenkins? Well, there are 4 ways in which you can identify the way a build can be scheduled or run in Jenkins. The first is when source code management commits new code into the repository. You can run Jenkins at that point. The second can be after the completion of other builds. So maybe you have multiple builds in your project that are dependent to each other, and when so many other builds have been executed, then you can have Jenkins run. You can schedule builds to run at a specified time. So you may have nightly builds of your code that illustrate the changes in the solution you're building. And then finally, you also can manually build a environment on request. Occasionally, you will want to also restart Jenkins. And so it's good that when a question around how do you restart Jenkins manually comes up, that you have the answers. And there are 2 ways in which you can do it. One is you can force a restart without waiting for builds to complete by using the Jenkins URL that you have for your environment /restart, or you can allow all running builds to complete before restart are required, and in which case you would use the command of the URL for your Jenkins environment /safe restart. So let's go into the 4th and final section of this first video, which talks about continuous testing with Selenium. So the first question you will be asked most likely around Selenium are, what are the 4 different Selenium components? And again, you will want to hold open your fingers because there are 4 distinct environments. You have Selenium Integrated Development Environment, or Selenium IDE. You have Selenium Remote Control, or Selenium RC. You have Selenium WebDriver, and then Selenium Grid. You'll be asked to explain each of those areas in more detail, but let's start off by looking at Selenium Driver. What are the different exceptions in Selenium WebDriver? So it's useful to remember that an exception is an event that occurs during the execution of a program that disrupts the normal flow of that program's instructions. And so we have 4. We have a timeout exception, an element not visible exception, no such element exception, and a session not found exception. And each of those, if we step through them, are the 4 different types of exceptions that can be thrown up when using the Selenium WebDriver. So as we evolve in our digital world with the different types of products that are available for us to be able to build solutions onto multiple platforms, you're going to be asked, can Selenium and other DevOps tools run in other environments? And so a good question around this is, can Selenium test an application in an Android web browser? And the short answer is absolutely yes, it can. But you have to use the Android driver for it to be able to work. So you want to be able to talk about the 3 different types of supported test within Selenium. So when the question comes up, what are the different test types supported by Selenium, you can answer it. And there are 3 different types of tests. First is a functional test. Second is a regression test, and third is a load testing test. The functional test is a kind of black box testing in which test cases are based on a specific area or feature within the software. A regression test helps you find any specific areas that functional tests or non-functional areas of the code wouldn't be able to detect. The load testing test allows you to monitor the response of a solution as you increase the volume of hits and how you're using the code are put onto it. An additional question you'll be asked is, how can you get a text of a web element using Selenium? Well, the get command is used to retrieve text of a specific web element. It's important to remember, however, that the command does not return any parameters, but just returns a string value. So you want to be able to capture that string value and discuss about it. A question you'll be asked around Selenium is, can you handle keyboard and mouse actions using Selenium? And the answer is yes, you can, but you have to make sure that you're using the Advanced User Interaction API. And the Advanced User Interaction API is something that can be scripted into your tests, and it allows you for capturing methods such as a click and hold and drag and drop mouse events, and then keyboard down or keyboard up key release events, so that if you want to capture, say, the use of Control Shift or a specific function button off the keyboard, you'd be able to capture those. Of the following 4 elements, which of these elements is not a web element method? A, get text. B, size. C, get tag name. D, send keys. And it's B, size. you're going to be asked to explain what is the difference for when we use find element or find elements. And so if we look at find element finds the first element in the current web page that matches the specified locator value. In contrast, find element finds all of the elements on the web page that matches the specified value. When using WebDriver, what are the driver close and driver quit commands? And these are two different methods used to close a web browser session in Selenium. So driver close will close the current web browser on which your focus is set, and driver quit closes all the browser windows and ends the WebDriver session completely. The final question that you are likely to be asked in using Selenium is, how can you submit a form using Selenium? Well, in this instance, that's relatively easy. The following lines of code will let you submit a form in Selenium, which would be web element el equals driver.findElement, and then you put in the ID and the element ID, and then L submit, open close parentheses, semicolon. So let's just get into the first section, which is configuration management. So one of the questions that you'll get asked right away is, why do you have SSL certificates used for Chef? Really fundamentally, your immediate answer should be security. SSL provides for a very high level of private security and private and public key pairing. This really is essential to ensure that you have a secure environment throughout your entire network. The second part should be that if you're using SSL and you're using the private public key model within SSL, you're able to guarantee the systems on your network that the Chef, that you'll be able to validate that the nodes within your network that Chef is validating against actually are the real nodes themselves, not imposters. So you will also be asked some questions such as the following. Which of the following commands would you use to stop or disable the HTTP service when the system boots? And you'll typically get 4 responses, and there'll be hashtag systemctl disable httpd.service, or is it system disable http.service, system disable httpd, or the final option, which is systemctl disable httpd.service. Your answer should be the first one, which is hashtag systemctl disable http.service. So Chef comes with a series of tools that allow it to function effectively, and one of the tools that you're going to be asked about is, what is Test Kitchen? And Test Kitchen is essentially a command line tool that allows you to be able to test out your cookbook before you actually deploy it to a real node. So some of the commands that you would use are, for instance, if you want to create an instance of Test Kitchen, you would do kitchen create. If you want to destroy an instance after you created it, you do kitchen destroy. And if you want to be able to combine multiple instances, you would do kitchen converge. So a question you'll get is around Chef is, how does Chef Apply differ from Chef Client? So fundamentally, the difference between them is that Chef Apply will validate the recipe that you're working on, whereas Chef Client looks to apply and validate the entire cookbook that's run in your server environment. So one is focused on the recipe and the other is focused on the entire cookbook. So there are some differences when you're working with different command lines. So for instance, when you're working with Puppet and you're working with one version of Puppet and you want to do, what is the command to sign a requested certificate? The top example here is for Puppet version 2.7, whereas the lower option here is for Puppet version 3. And that's something to bear in mind when you're going through your interview process, is that the tools that are used within a continuous integration, continuous delivery DevOps model do vary. And so you want to be able to talk knowledgeably about the different versions of the tools so that when you're talking to your interviewer, you're able to show the deep knowledge that you have. Which open source or community tools do you use to make Puppet more powerful? And essentially this question is going to be asking you to look beyond the core foundation of Puppet itself. And so the 3 options you have is being able to track configurations with Jira, which you should be doing anyway, but it's a great way to be able to clearly communicate the work that's being done with Puppet. Version control can be extended with Git. And then the changes should be passed through Jenkins. So the 3 tools you want to be looking at: integration with Jira, Git, and Jenkins. So what are the resources in Puppet? Well, fundamentally, there are four. The resources are basic units of any configuration management tool. They are the features of the nodes. They are the written catalog and the execution of the catalog on a node. So as we dig deeper into Puppet, one of the things that you are likely to be asked regarding Puppet is, what is a class in Puppet? And so a class in Puppet is really the name blocks in your manifest that contain the various configurations. And this can include services, files, and packages. And we have on the screen here an example of what a class would look like when you write it out. And you may want to memorize just one class. Don't memorize just a whole set of classes. Just memorize one. The person that's interviewing you is just really looking for someone who has a working knowledge. They're not looking for you to have memorized complete massive classes, but having one small class to be able to illustrate the experience you have is extremely valuable to the interviewer, particularly if it's a technical interview. So as we move into Ansible, one of the things that you're going to be asked around Ansible is, what is Ansible role? So a role is an independent block of tasks and variable files and templates embedded inside of the playbook. So the example we have here on the screen actually shows you one role within a playbook. And in this role, it is to install Tomcat on a node. Again, as with previous question within Puppet of a class, it's probably good to have memorized just one or two roles so you can talk knowledgeably about Ansible when you're having your interview. So when you're working with Ansible, when should you be using the curly brackets? And so just as a frame of reference, there's often two different ways that these kind of brackets are referred to. They're either referred to as French brackets or curly brackets. Either way, what you'll be wanting to ask is, when would you use these specific types of brackets within Ansible? And really, the answer comes down to two things. One is that it makes it easier to distinguish strings and undefined variables. And the second is for putting together conditional statements when you are actually using variables. And the example we have here is this prints the value of, and we have foo, and we have to then put in the variable conditional statement of foo is defined as something. So what is the best way to make content reusable and redistributable with Ansible? And there's really essentially three. The first is to include a submodule or another file in your playbook. The second is to import an improvement of an include, which ensures that a file is added only once. And then the third is roles to manage the tasks within the playbook. So a question you will be asked is, provide a differences between Ansible and Puppets. So if we look at Ansible, it's a very easy agentless installation. It's based on Python. You can configure it with YAML, and there are no support for Windows. In contrast, Puppet is an agent-based installation. It's written in Ruby. The configuration files are written in DSL, and it has support on all popular operating systems. So we dig deeper into the actual architecture. Ansible, it has a much more simple architecture, and it's definitely a push-only architecture. In contrast to Puppet, it's a more complicated but more sophisticated architecture where you're able to have a complete environment managed by the Puppet architecture. So let's get on to our next section, which is containerization. So let's go through, and you're going to be asked to explain what the architecture of Docker is. And Docker really is the most popular containerization environment. So Docker uses a client-server architecture. The Docker client is a service which runs in a command line. And then the Docker daemon, which is run as a REST API within the command line, will accept the requests and interacts with the operating system in order to build the Docker images and run the Docker containers. And then the Docker image is a template of instructions which is used to create containers. The Docker container is an executable package of applications and its dependencies together. And then finally, the Docker registry is a service to host and distribute Docker images among other users. So you'll also be asked to provide what are the advantages of Docker over virtual machine. And this is something that comes up very consistently. In fact, you may want to even extend it as having what are the differences between having a dedicated machine, a virtual machine, and a Docker or Docker-like environment. And really, the arguments for Docker are just absolutely fantastic. First of all, Docker containers occupy significantly less space than a virtual machine or a dedicated machine. The boot up time on Docker is significantly faster than a VM. Containers have a much better performance as they are hosted in a single Docker image. Docker is highly efficient and very easy to scale, particularly when you start working with Kubernetes. Easily portable across multiple platforms, and then finally, for space allocation, Docker data volumes can be shared and reused among multiple containers. The argument against virtual machines is significant, and particularly if you're going into an older environment where a company is still using actual dedicated hardware and haven't moved to a cloud or cloud-like environment, your arguments for Docker are going to be very, very persuasive. Be very clear on what the advantages are for Docker over a virtual machine, because you want to be able to succinctly share them with your team. And this is something that's important when you're going through the interview process, but also equally important, particularly if you're working with a company that's transitioning or going through a digital transformation where they aren't used to working with tools like Docker. You need to be able to effectively share with that team what the benefits are. So how do we share Docker containers with different nodes? And in this instance, what you want to be able to do is leverage the power of Docker Swarm. So Docker Swarm is a tool which allows the IT administrators and developers to create and manage clusters of Swarm nodes within the Docker platform. And there are two elements to the node. There's the manager node, and then there's the worker node. The manager node, as you'd assume, manages the entire infrastructure, and the worker node is actually the work of the agent as it gets executed. So what are the commands to create a Docker Swarm? And so here we have an example of what a manager node would look like. And once you've created a swarm on your manager node, you can now add worker nodes to that swarm. And again, when you're stepping through this process, be very precise in the execution path that needs to be taken to be able to effectively create a swarm. So start with the manager node, and then you create a worker node. And then finally, when a node is initialized as a manager node, it can immediately create a token, and that token is used for the worker nodes and associating the IP address with the worker nodes. Question 17, how to run multiple containers using a single service. It is possible to run multiple containers as a single service by using Docker Compose. And Docker Compose will actually run each of the services in isolation so that they can interact with each other. The language used to write out the compose files that allow you to run the service is called YAML, and YAML stands for yet another markup language. So what is the use of a Docker file? So a Docker file actually is used for creating Docker images using the build command. So let's go through and show on the screen what that would look like. And this would be an opportunity where if you're actually in a technical interview, you could potentially even ask, hey, can I draw on a whiteboard and show you what the architecture for using the build command would look like and what the process would look like? Again, when you're going through an interview process, as someone who interviews a lot of people, one of the things that I really like is when an interview candidate does something that's slightly different. And in this instance, this is a great example of where you can stand up to the whiteboard and actually show what can actually be done through actually creating images on the whiteboard very quickly, little square boxes where you can actually show the flow for creating a build environment. As an architect, this should be something that you are comfortable doing, and by doing it in the interview, and certainly you want to ask permission before you actually do it, but doing this in the interview really helps demonstrate your comfortable feelings of working with these kind of architecture drawings. So back to the question of creating a Docker file. So we go through and we have a Docker file that actually then goes ahead and creates the Docker image, which then in turn creates the Docker container. And then we are able to push that out up to a Docker Hub and then share that Docker Hub with everybody else as part of the Docker registry with the whole network. So what are the differences between Docker image and Docker containers? So let's go through the Docker image. So the Docker images are templates of a Docker container. An image is built using a Docker file, and it stores that Docker file in a Docker repository or a Docker Hub. And you can use Docker Hub as an example. And the image layer is a read-only file system. The Docker container is a collection of the runtime instances of a Docker image, and the containers are created using Docker images, and they are stored in the Docker daemon, and every container is a read-write file system. So you can't replace the information, you can only append to it. So while you can actually use YAML for writing your, so a question you're going to be asked is, instead of YAML, what can be an alternate file to build Docker Compose? So YAML is the one that is the default, but you can also use JSON. So if you are comfortable working with JSON, and that is something that you should be get comfortable with, is you want to be able to use that to name your files. And as a frame of reference, JSON is a logical way of being able to do value paired matching using a JavaScript-like syntax. So you're going to be asked to how to create a Docker container. So let's go through what that would look, and we'll break it down task by task. So the task is going to be create a MySQL Docker container. So to do that, you want to be able to build a Docker image or pull from an existing Docker image from a Docker repository or hub. And then you want to be able to then use Docker to create a new container, which has MySQL from the existing Docker image. Simultaneously, the layer of read-write file system is also created on top of that image. And below at the bottom of the screen, we have what the command lines look for that. So what is the difference between a registry and a repository? So let's go through that. So for the Docker registry and repository, for the registry, we have a Docker registry is an open source server-side service used for hosting and distributing Docker images. Whereas in contrast, for repository, it's a collection of multiple versions of a Docker image. In a registry, a user can distinguish between Docker images with their tag names. And then finally, on the registry, Docker also has its own default registry called Docker Hub. For the repository, it is a collection of multiple versions of Docker images. It is stored in a Docker registry, and it has two types, a public and private registry, so you can actually create your own enterprise registry. So you're going to be asked, what are the cloud platforms that support Docker? Really, list them all. We have listed here Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Rackspace, but you could add in there IBM, Bluemix. Could put in Red Hat. Really, any of the cloud service providers out there today do support Docker. It's just become an industry standard. So what is the purpose of expose and publish commands in Docker? So if we go through, expose is an instruction used in Docker file, whereas publish is used in Docker run command. For expose, it is used to expose ports within a Docker network, whereas with publish, it can be used outside of a Docker environment. For expose, it is a documenting instruction used at the time of building an image and running a container, whereas with publish, it is used to map a host port to a running container port. For expose is the command used in Docker, whereas for publish, we use the command -p for when we're doing our command line used in Docker. And examples of these are expose 8080, or with Docker, we would put in, or for publish, we would do the example Docker run -d-p and then 0.0.0.80, 80:80 as our command line. So let's look at continuous monitoring. So with continuous monitoring, how does Nagios help in continuous monitoring of systems, applications, and servers? And so this is really just a high-level question of using Nagios within your environment. And you should be able to just come back very quickly and say, Nagios allows you to help manage the servers and check if they're being sufficiently utilized and if there are any task failures that need to be addressed. And so there are three areas of utilization and risk that you want to be able to manage. This is being able to verify the status and services of the entire network, the health of your infrastructure as a whole, and if applications are working properly together with web services and APIs that are reachable. So the second question you'll be asked is, how does Nagios help in continuous monitoring of systems, applications, and services? So it's able to do this by having the initial Nagios process and scheduler and the additional plugins that you would use for your network connect with the remote resources and the Nagios web interface to be able to run status checks on a predefined schedule. So what do you mean by Nagios Remote Plugin Executor, or the NPRE of Nagios? So NPRE allows you to execute plugins on Linux Unix machines that allow you to do additional monitoring and machine metrics such as disk usage, CPU load, etc. What are the ports used by Nagios for monitoring purposes? In this example, there are three, and they're easy to remember, so I would memorize these three, but they're essentially ports 5666, 5667, and 5668. So there are two types of checks within Nagios. So you will be asked for what is an active and passive check in Nagios. So an active check is initiated by the Nagios process and is run on a regular schedule. A passive check is initiated and formed by an external application or process. So this may be where a system is failing. And results are submitted to Nagios for processing. And to continue with this, for what is an active and passive check, active checks are initiated by the check logic within the Nagios daemon. Nagios will execute a plugin and pass information about what needs to be checked. Plugin will then check the operational state of the host or service and then process the results of the host or service check and send out notifications. In contrast with the passive check, it is an external application that initiates the check. It writes the results of the check to an external command line file. Nagios reads the external command file and places the results of all passive checks in a queue for later processing, so you can go back and revalidate. And then Nagios may send out notifications, log alerts, etc., depending on the results that they get from checking the information. So you're going to be asked to explain the main configuration file and its location in Nagios. So the main configuration file consists of a number of directives that affect how Nagios operates. So consider this as the configuration file that is read by both Nagios processor and the CGIs. So this will allow you to be able to manage the main configuration file that's placed into your settings directory. So what is the Nagios Network Analyzer? And again, hold out your 4 fingers because there are 4 options here. So the Nagios Network Analyzer 1, provides an in-depth look at all your network traffic, source, and security threats. 2, allows system admins to gather high-level information on the health of your network. 3, provides a central view of your network traffic and bandwidth data. And then 4, allows you to proactive in resolving outages, abnormal behavior, and threats before they affect critical business processes. So what are the benefits of HTTP and SSL certificate monitoring with Nagios? So with HTTP certificate monitoring, it allows you to have increased server and services and application availability, obviously very important, fast detection of network outages and protocol failures, and allows web transaction and web service performance monitoring. The SSL certificate monitoring allows you for increased website availability, frequent application availability, and provides increased security.